This story begins deep in the wild. A desperate cry pierces the savannah, sharp, trembling, and full of fear. You turn toward the sound, and what you see defies everything nature ever taught us. In the fading amber light, the tall grass ripples like an ocean of fire. Dust hangs thick in the air, shimmering under the dying sun. Then you hear it again, that cry, softer now, weaker. It's the sound of something clinging to life. You move closer, parting the grass with trembling hands. There, beneath a cracked acacia, lies a lioness. Her golden fur is matted with blood and rain. Her sides heave with exhaustion. And beside her, barely breathing, is her cub. But this cub is different. Its fur gleams white as ivory. Its pink nose twitches with effort. Eyes closed, fragile and blind to the burning world around it. An albino, a rarity so pure, it seems like a creature made of light. The lioness nudges her cub weakly, trying to lift it to hide it. You can see the bite marks on her flank, the torn flesh near her shoulder. Hyenas, perhaps, scavengers that sensed weakness. She must have fought them off through the night. The savannah is quiet now, but not safe. Far away, a low growl rolls through the darkening plains. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of blood. You feel it, that ancient rhythm of life and death pulsing through the wild. Here, mercy has no place. Yet what you're witnessing doesn't belong to instinct. It belongs to something deeper, grief. The lioness lifts her head, and for a fleeting moment her eyes meet yours. They aren't the eyes of a predator. They're the eyes of a mother pleading for help. In that silence between you, something unspoken passes. A vow, but in the tall grass something stirred. At dawn, the savannah awakens under a pale, cold light. Mist rolls over the golden plains, wrapping the acacia trees in ghostly silence. The night's violence has faded, but its memory still lingers. Claw marks etched into the dust, feathers scattered where vultures had waited for the end. You move quietly now, each step crunching against the dry earth, following the faint trail of blood that leads to a hollow near the river bend. There, the lioness still lies, curled around her cub as though the world itself were trying to take him away. Her breathing is shallow, eyes half-lidded from exhaustion. She hasn't eaten in days. The cub rests beneath her chest, its tiny ribs rising and falling in rhythm with her failing strength. When the Rangers arrive, their radios crackle through the soft dawn. Among them is Grace Thornton, calm, steady, and carrying a compassion that somehow cuts through the wild's indifference. She kneels, her boots sinking into the damp soil, and whispers, "It's real." An albino lion cub. The team exchanges stunned glances. In the animal kingdom, albinism is more than rare. It's dangerous. The cub's pale coat, so beautiful to human eyes, is a beacon in the wild. It reflects the sun, making camouflage impossible. To predators, it's a glowing target. To poachers, it's a prize worth killing for. Grace studies the mother's wounds, deep lacerations across her flank, swollen and raw. She must have fought off an entire hyena pack to protect the cub. The fact that she's still alive feels like defiance. Grace lowers her voice, radioing the base. "We need to move fast. She won't survive another night." But when she steps closer, the lioness growls, low, desperate, protective. The sound isn't anger, it's fear. Even dying, she won't surrender her child. The Rangers spread out, forming a slow circle. Grace sets down her tranquilizer rifle, her hands steady despite her pounding heart. She knows one mistake could trigger panic, and panic could mean the cub's death. So she waits. The wind shifts, carrying her scent toward the lioness. The mother's ears twitch. Her eyes narrow. Then for a brief second she stops growling. Her gaze softens, confusion flickering behind it. It's as if she understands that these humans are not predators, not this time. Grace whispers, "Easy. We're here to help." The tranquilizer dart hisses softly, finding its mark in the lioness's shoulder. She flinches, tries to rise, then collapses beside her cub, her head falling gently to the earth. Grace rushes forward, scooping the tiny albino cub into her gloved hands. Its skin feels warm and fragile, veins visible beneath the pale fur. She wraps it in a soft cloth, holding it close to her chest as thunder rumbles in the far distance. For a moment, everything is still. The lioness lies sleeping, The cub whimpers, and the first drops of rain begin to fall, gentle at first, then harder, until the air fills with the scent of wet dust and new life. Grace glances at the horizon. The storm is coming fast. They lift the lioness onto a stretcher, load the cub into a padded crate, and start toward the rescue truck. The sky darkens to bruised purple, lightning cracking over the plains. Grace looks back once, at the grass, at the place where the wild gave up one of its secrets. She doesn't yet realize the depth of what she's saving. Because this cub isn't just rare, he's a miracle born into a world that doesn't forgive miracles. And far behind them, in the tall grass they've just left behind, two pairs of eyes gleam in the rain, unblinking. Something else had seen the rescue, something waiting for nightfall, and the vultures weren't the only ones circling. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a savannah washed clean, yet heavy with the scent of damp earth and lightning. In the distance, the first rays of sunlight stretched across the plains like golden ribbons, touching everything that had survived the night. Inside the small ranger outpost, the world was quieter. The hum of generators, the soft hiss of an IV line, the rhythmic breathing of a sleeping lioness. Grace Thornton sat nearby, her uniform still streaked with mud and rain, her eyes fixed on the creature she had promised to save. The lioness lay on a blanket of straw, her flank stitched and bandaged. Beside her, in a small heated enclosure, the albino cub slept, its fur glowing faintly under the lamp. Grace had named him Spirit that morning, unable to call him anything else. There was something otherworldly about him, something that didn't belong to the laws of the savannah. Even the other rangers seemed uneasy, whispering that perhaps this cub was an omen, a creature the wild itself had not intended to keep. But Grace didn't believe in omens. She believed in survival. She spent hours monitoring their vitals, her notes scrawled in the margins of weather-stained papers. Low pigment sensitivity, she muttered to herself, risk of blindness, extreme sun sensitivity. Every word sounded like a challenge, another barrier Spirit would need to overcome. When the lioness stirred, Grace froze, watching as those golden eyes flickered open, hazy at first, then sharp. For a long moment they simply stared at each other. Human and lioness, two mothers in different ways, bound by a single instinct, protect what is fragile. The lioness tensed, her muscles rippling beneath the bandages. Grace stayed perfectly still. No sudden movements, no words, only silence. Finally Grace spoke, barely above a whisper. "He's safe. I promise you that." The lioness blinked, her gaze shifting toward the sound of Spirit's soft mewling. She tried to rise, but the sedation still lingered. Her paws slipped weakly on the straw, claws scraping the concrete beneath. Grace stood, moving closer, slowly, respectfully, and reached for the latch on the cub's enclosure. She lifted Spirit gently, the cub's tiny claws clutching at her jacket. His eyes opened, pale blue, clouded, searching. She lowered him to the floor, just inches from his mother's muzzle. The air trembled with tension. The lioness leaned forward, her nostrils flaring. One soft breath, then another, and suddenly, a sound deep and low but not a growl. A hum, a mother's sigh. Spirit pressed against her paw, curling into the familiar warmth of her fur. Grace stepped back, her heart pounding as relief washed over her, like the first light of dawn. For the first time in hours, the station felt alive again. One of the younger rangers, Daniel, watched from the corner. "You think she knows we helped her?" he asked. Grace smiled faintly. "She doesn't have to know. She just has to trust." Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, whispering its age-old song. But something in the tone had shifted, less of survival, more of surrender. In that fragile peace, a connection had formed, one that neither man nor beast could fully explain. Still, Grace knew this balance was temporary. In the wild, trust was never a gift. It was a gamble. And somewhere out beyond the fences, nature was watching, patient, calculating, waiting for its turn to reclaim what was hers. But trust in the wild never lasts long. By late afternoon, the savannah had grown restless again. The sky, once clear and golden, began to bruise with the colors of an approaching storm. Indigo clouds stretching low, crackling with the faint pulse of lightning. The wind picked up, whistling through the dry acacias, rattling the tin roof of the ranger station. Inside, Grace was on edge. The lioness had regained strength faster than expected, pacing the enclosure, her tail flicking with unease. She hadn't eaten, hadn't rested. Every sound, the creak of metal, the roll of distant thunder, made her tense, her golden eyes searching for her cub. Spirit, meanwhile, was thriving. His body had filled out, his steps growing steadier, his small roars echoing weakly through the clinic. But his pale fur made him a ghost in the daylight, vulnerable, exposed. Grace knew that no matter how much care they gave, the wild was calling him back. It always did, yet releasing him too soon meant death. Keeping him too long meant breaking what was natural. The line between rescue and interference had never felt thinner. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Grace received a radio call, static, broken by urgency. Poacher tracks, heading toward the North Ridge. Copy. She froze. North Ridge, that was near their station. Her eyes darted to the window, where the tall grass was already bending under the wind. Copy, she replied. Lock down the perimeter. We can't risk them getting near the cub. Daniel and the others moved fast, securing the gate, loading tranquilizer rifles, checking the generator fuel. But the lioness had sensed it too, danger invisible but near. She growled low, circling her enclosure, her eyes fixed on the storm outside. Lightning flashed, thunder split the air, and for a brief instant Grace saw her reflection mirrored in those wild eyes, not as a rescuer, but as something smaller. Something helpless in the face of nature's will. The rain came hard. The world outside turned to chaos. Sheets of water hammering the earth, trees thrashing under the wind. Power flickered, lights dimmed, and the generator coughed before steadying again. Grace's voice cut through the noise. Everyone inside, now! She rushed to Spirit's cage, lifting him into a crate lined with towels. The cub whimpered, frightened by the thunder's roar. Then came the sound, faint yet distinct, footsteps, heavy ones. Grace turned. The back door shuddered against the wind. Daniel aimed his flashlight. For a heartbeat, the beam caught movement, a shape soaked and limping emerging from the shadows. Grace's breath caught. No, it can't be. It was another lion, a male, broad-shouldered, eyes glinting with predatory fire. He must have followed the scent through the storm, drawn to the faint smell of blood and cub. He slammed against the fence, roaring, the metal groaning beneath the force. The lioness in the pen erupted in response, hurling herself against her cage, desperate to reach him, to fight, to protect, to destroy whatever threat had come for her child. "Keep him back!" Grace shouted over the wind, grabbing the tranquilizer rifle. Daniel fired a dart, but it struck the fence, useless. The male roared again, circling, his mane plastered with rain. Then as lightning split the sky, Grace took aim, one steady breath, one silent prayer, and fired. The dart found its mark. The lion stumbled, snarled, then fell into the mud outside the enclosure. For a long, suspended moment, only the storm spoke. Grace lowered her rifle, her pulse pounding in her ears. Spirit whimpered softly from the crate, the sound trembling through the heavy air. The lioness pressed herself against the bars, eyes wide and wild. Grace knelt before her, drenched and shaking. "He's safe," she whispered. "You're both safe." But as thunder rolled again, deep and distant, she knew safety was only temporary. Out here, storms never ended. They just changed shape. They weren't alone on this road. Morning came slowly after the storm, as if the world itself was hesitant to wake. The horizon glowed faintly pink, washed in mist and the smell of wet soil. The thunder had passed, but the echoes of the night still lingered, in the overturned crates, in the mud-soaked footprints near the fence, in the uneasy silence of the animals that had survived the chaos. Inside the ranger station, the air was heavy with exhaustion. Grace hadn't slept. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling slightly as she checked on her two patients, the lioness and her pale cub. Spirit. The lioness was weak again, her body spent from the adrenaline that had carried her through the storm. She lay in the corner of her enclosure, her breath slow, her head resting on her paws. Spirit, on the other hand, seemed restless, pacing, mewling softly, searching for warmth. Grace opened the crate, lifted the cub carefully, and carried him to his mother. The moment she set him down, he pressed himself against her neck, his tiny claws kneading her fur as if to remind her that life was still here, still clinging. The lioness stirred, eyes fluttering open, and for the first time since the storm, a low, contented rumble escaped her throat. Grace smiled faintly, wiping the rain from her sleeves. "You're tougher than you look," she whispered. But beneath her voice was a fatigue that ran deeper than sleep. She had seen too many rescues like this, moments where hope flickered like a flame, only to be snuffed out by the brutal rhythm of the wild. Yet something about this pair felt different. The mother's refusal to give in, the cub's unearthly resilience. Even nature, in all its cruelty, seemed reluctant to extinguish them. By mid-morning, the sky cleared completely. A thin, golden light poured through the broken clouds, bathing the outpost in warmth. The rangers moved quietly, repairing fences, collecting spent darts, clearing debris. Daniel walked up beside Grace, holding a clipboard. "We got word from the reserve," he said softly. "They want to relocate her and the cub to the recovery compound by next week." Grace nodded. It made sense. The compound was safer. Higher fences, medical staff, controlled terrain. But she also knew what that meant: separation. Once Spirit was weaned, the Rangers would have to keep him apart until release. It was the only way to prepare him for the wild. Grace looked back at them. Mother and cub bathed in sunlight, the white fur gleaming against the golden earth. The sight was heartbreakingly beautiful, and she wondered, who are we to decide when nature's love ends? She spent the next few days tending to their wounds, documenting every small victory. Spirit's vision was stabilizing. His skin no longer burned in the light. The lioness regained her strength, her appetite returning, her posture regal once more. Grace often caught her watching, those amber eyes tracking every move, every gesture. It was no longer fear. It was something else, recognition. One evening, as dusk bled across the plains, Grace sat outside the enclosure, writing in her field journal. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked grass, and the sound of cicadas carried across the plains like a chorus of memory. Spirit rolled near the bars, pawing gently at her boot. She laughed softly. "You shouldn't be this friendly," she murmured. "The wild won't forgive it." But he only blinked at her, his pale eyes filled with quiet curiosity. There was no fear in them, no instinctual divide between human and beast, only a strange, wordless trust. Inside, the lioness watched in silence, her tail flicking slowly. When Grace finally stood to leave, she turned to see the mother nuzzle her cub close, wrapping him in her great paws. The gesture was simple, ancient, universal. Protection. The sun dipped below the horizon, turning the grasslands to gold and shadow. Grace looked out at the vastness of it all and felt that old ache again, that knowledge that every rescue, no matter how pure, was temporary. Because out here life never truly rested. It only waited. And as the first stars began to appear far out on the open plain, two sets of glowing eyes watched from the dark. Distant, silent, patient. And somewhere deep within her, instinct started to pull her homeward. The savannah had changed since the storm. Grass grew taller and greener, swaying beneath skies that burned with the colors of late summer. Herds of antelope moved across the plains again. Birds wheeled in bright spirals above the acacias, and the scent of renewal lingered in the air. But for Grace, that same wind carried the weight of a decision she could no longer postpone. It was time to let them go. Weeks had passed since the night of the storm. Spirit was growing fast, his once frail body now lean and strong. His movements had become confident, his small roars sharper, echoing faintly through the compound each dawn. He no longer flinched at thunder or the crack of distant rifles. But his white fur still made him a beacon under the sun, beautiful but dangerous. Grace often found herself watching him from a distance, notebook in hand, trying to balance her scientific objectivity with the ache in her chest. "You were never meant to belong to us," she'd whisper under her breath, "but I wish you could stay." The lioness, the Rangers now called her Nara, had healed almost completely. Her gait was strong again, her golden coat gleaming under the morning light. Yet she had grown restless. Each night her roars grew louder, echoing across the fences, a mother's call to a world beyond the metal and stone. It wasn't aggression, it was yearning, instinct calling her back to where she belonged. Grace understood that sound all too well. Nature didn't grant second chances easily, and keeping Nara captive for too long would turn her strength into despair. So the plan was made. The relocation would happen at dawn. Grace would lead the transport herself, 30 kilometers north, to the reserve's open range, where the Pride territories began. There Nara and Spirit would be free, but the wilderness was not what it once was. Rogue males had been spotted along the river corridors, their movements unpredictable, their hunger unrelenting. And deep in Grace's mind, one fear grew louder than the rest. Would they accept Spirit, or would his difference mark him as a threat? The morning of release was breathtaking. The world glowed gold under the early light, and the air shimmered with warmth. Grace oversaw the final preparations, her boots sinking into soft mud as the Rangers loaded the sedated lions into the transport crates. Daniel adjusted the straps, his brow furrowed. "You sure this is the right time?" he asked. Grace nodded slowly. "If we wait, she'll lose her edge. The wild's calling her back, and she's answering." The truck rumbled through the plains, bouncing over dirt tracks lined with acacia thorns and scattered bones bleached white by the sun. Grace rode in silence beside the crates, one hand resting on Spirit's container. Through the ventilation slits, she could see his pale fur shifting in the light, his chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. For a moment she closed her eyes and listened to the hum of insects, the distant call of a hornbill, the faint rattle of chains. When they finally reached the ridge, Grace climbed down first. The land stretched endlessly before her, golden and untamed, painted with shadows of clouds moving slowly overhead. This was where it would happen. The gates were opened. The air was still. Nara emerged first. Groggy but alert, she stepped into the open, her muscles rippling beneath her coat. She sniffed the wind, ears twitching, tail swaying like a pendulum of memory. Then, as if drawn by invisible thread, Spirit stumbled after her, blinking against the light, his fur glowing like frost against the earth. For a heartbeat, mother and cub froze. Then, with one soft rumble, she brushed her muzzle against his head. Grace watched them from the truck, every nerve alive with awe and dread. "Go on," she whispered, barely able to breathe. The two lions walked forward side by side, their forms small against the endless horizon. Every step was a victory, every breath an act of defiance against everything that should have killed them. Grace felt something tighten in her chest. Pride, fear, wonder, all tangled together. But as the wind shifted, a sound rolled across the plains, faint, deep, and haunting. A roar, not Nara's, not Spirit's. Grace froze, her eyes scanning the distant hills. Movement, shadows in the tall grass flickering between the trees. Her heart sank. The Pride was near. Spirit turned toward the sound, ears twitching, his small body trembling in curiosity. Nara stepped in front of him, tail raised, her eyes fixed on the unseen shapes beyond the ridge. The reunion she had longed for was about to happen, but not in the way Grace had hoped. Nature's balance was shifting again, and the Pride had begun to hunt once more. The wind carried their scent first, raw, musky, ancient. Then came the sound, low rumbles, short bursts of snarls, the kind that send every prey animal into silence. Grace's binoculars trembled in her hands as she spotted them cresting the ridge. 4 lions, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of seasoned hunters. At their center was the dominant male, massive, his mane dark and tangled from battle. His golden eyes locked on Nara and Spirit with the weight of judgment, the kind only nature delivers. Nara stiffened. Her muscles rippled, tail flicking once, her body angling between the male and her cub. Grace could almost feel the air tighten, thick with tension. Every instinct in Nara screamed to flee, yet every piece of her being demanded she stand. Spirit pressed close to her leg, trembling. He was too young to understand, but he knew danger. He could feel it in her heartbeat, in the stillness of the grass around them. The dominant male took another step forward, his massive paws pressing the earth in rhythm with the wind. Two lionesses followed behind him, their eyes sharp, uncertain. They could smell it, the difference in the cub. The pale fur, the strange scent of humans, the absence of the wild's camouflage. To them, Spirit was not one of their own. He was an anomaly, and the wild does not forgive what it cannot explain. Grace's voice cracked through the radio. "Do we intervene?" Daniel hesitated. "If we move now, we'll spook them. She'll have to handle this." Grace swallowed hard. "She's outnumbered, Dan." Down on the plain, Nara lowered her head, baring her teeth in silent defiance. The male snarled, mane bristling, his gaze shifting from her to the cub. He saw weakness and prey and began to circle. Nara roared, the sound echoing like thunder across the ridge. Spirit flinched, pressing into her chest. The pride froze. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Grace's breath caught. It was a test of dominance, of blood, of belonging. The male lunged first, his roar ripping through the stillness. Dust exploded beneath his paws as he charged. Nara met him head-on, their bodies colliding with a sound like cracking stone. Claws flashed, teeth tore, and the earth itself seemed to shake beneath their fury. From the truck, Grace's hand tightened on her tranquilizer rifle. "Come on, Nara," she whispered through clenched teeth. "Don't give up." Spirit cried out, pacing wildly as his mother fought, her body battered but unyielding. The other lionesses watched, torn between loyalty to the pride and awe for the courage before them. And then something shifted. Nara struck, not in rage, but with precision born from desperation. Her paw caught the male across the muzzle, deep enough to draw blood. He stumbled back, snarling. For a long, terrible moment they stood, two forces of nature locked in silence. Then slowly the male lowered his head. The message was clear. Nara had won. She turned to her cub, licking his face, trembling with exhaustion, but alive. The other lionesses backed away, their eyes lowered. The wild had spoken, and for once mercy had answered. Grace exhaled, her body shaking with relief. "She did it," she whispered. She actually did it. Out on the plain, the wind shifted again, carrying the scent of blood, dust, and survival. Spirit leaned into his mother, his pale coat gleaming beneath the sun. But the wild wasn't done testing them yet. The savannah held its breath. The storm of battle had passed, but the air still trembled with tension, the scent of blood, dust, and dominance lingering like smoke after fire. Nara stood over Spirit, chest heaving, eyes locked on the retreating male. Every fiber of her body screamed for rest, but she couldn't lower her guard. Not yet, not with her cub still trembling against her paws. The other lionesses lingered at a distance, uncertain. They had seen strength, the kind that earns respect even in the brutal hierarchy of the wild. One lioness crept closer, her head bowed slightly. It wasn't submission, not entirely. It was acknowledgement. Nara's victory had rewritten the order, if only for a moment. Still, the danger hadn't passed. The wounded male limped away into the grass, but his pride was broken, and broken males always returned, not for revenge, but for survival. Grace watched through the scope of her binoculars, her breath shallow, heart racing. "She's holding position," she whispered. "God, she's actually holding them back." Daniel, standing beside her, nodded, his knuckles white against the rifle. "But he'll come back, Grace. They always come back." Below them, Spirit tried to stand tall, his pale coat streaked with dust and blood from his mother's fight. He looked out across the open land, blinking into the sun, unaware of the line his life had just crossed. He was no longer just a cub. He was the symbol of something rare, something the wild itself wasn't sure it wanted to accept. Then it happened. A shadow flickered through the tall grass, fast, low, and deliberate. Grace caught it first. "Movement, 9 o'clock," she shouted into the radio. Another lion, leaner, hungrier, emerging from the brush. A rogue, not part of the pride, drawn by the scent of weakness. His eyes locked on Spirit. Nara turned instantly, her instincts snapping to life. She roared, the sound slicing through the plains like a blade. The rogue didn't flinch. He crouched, muscles rippling beneath his scarred hide, preparing to strike. Grace didn't hesitate. She raised her rifle, aimed through the haze, and fired. The The dart hissed through the air, a heartbeat of silence, and missed. The rogue lunged. Nara met him halfway, the impact sending dust and grass spiraling into the air. Spirit scrambled backward, his cries drowned beneath the chaos. Grace reloaded, hands shaking, but Daniel grabbed her wrist. "If you hit her, I won't." She snapped, sighting again. The fight was savage, primal, a blur of claws, snarls, and blood. The rogue was younger, faster, but Nara had purpose. Every strike she made was driven by something beyond survival. It was love, pure and feral. She took a hit to the shoulder, another to the flank, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Then, finally, a flash of motion. Grace pulled the trigger. The dart hit. The rogue staggered, snarled, then collapsed into the grass with a final guttural growl. Silence fell, thick and trembling. Nara stood swaying, her sides heaving. Spirit crept toward her, his tiny head pressing against her bloodied chest. She bent down, nuzzling him, her breath ragged but steady. Grace lowered the rifle, her eyes wet. "She saved him again," she whispered, even when she had nothing left. The Rangers climbed down from the truck, moving cautiously. Grace approached the pair, her boots sinking into the wet earth. Nara lifted her head, meeting her gaze, not as predator to human, but as mother to mother. For a single breath, there was peace. No fences, no fear, just understanding. And in that golden stillness, beneath a sky streaked with fire and ash, Spirit raised his head and let out a small, trembling roar. It was soft, but it carried. The wild had tested them both. And still they stood. The days that followed were quiet, unnaturally so. The kind of silence that comes only after the wild has made its decision. The rogue lion was gone, sedated and relocated far from the territory. The dominant male had not returned. And in the golden plains, where so much blood had been spilled, peace had returned, fragile but real. Grace watched from the edge of the reserve every morning, binoculars in hand, tracking the faint shapes of mother and cub moving across the open land. Spirit had grown stronger. His movements were more sure now, his pale fur glowing like sunlight trapped in flesh. Against the backdrop of amber grass and red dust, he looked almost otherworldly, a walking miracle that refused to blend in with the world around him. But he was learning. Every dawn, Nara taught him to stalk the shadows, to crouch low, to listen for the rhythm of hooves and heartbeats. Grace often caught her breath watching them. The way the lioness moved, slow and deliberate, every gesture filled with the language of the wild. Spirit mimicked her perfectly, though his white coat betrayed him with every step. Yet somehow, the savannah seemed to accept him. Even the herds, once fearful, no longer bolted at his sight. It was as if the land itself had decided to let this anomaly belong. Weeks turned into months. The rains came again, heavy and warm, painting the plains in green and gold. The rivers swelled and new life bloomed across the horizon. Grace's reports piled high, filled with field notes and blurry photographs, but it wasn't data that filled her heart. It was awe. She had witnessed something she couldn't fully explain. Not just survival, but a rewriting of nature's old rules. One evening, as the sun sank low, Grace climbed the lookout ridge for one last survey. The air was painted with the scent of rain and the hum of crickets. She lifted her binoculars, and there they were. Nara and Spirit, standing at the edge of a waterhole, their reflections rippling side by side in the fading light. Spirit was nearly half his mother's size now, his mane just beginning to show. He moved with quiet strength, confident yet calm, the pale shimmer of his coat glowing against the amber dusk. Grace felt a lump rise in her throat. "You made it," she whispered to the wind. "You both made it." As she lowered the binoculars, something unexpected happened. Nara lifted her head, slowly, as though sensing the familiar presence watching from afar. Her eyes met Grace's across the distance, unblinking, steady. Then with a low rumble, she turned and nudged Spirit gently forward. Together, they walked into the tall grass until their shapes dissolved into the gold of the savannah. Grace stood there for a long time, her eyes burning with tears she didn't bother to hide. Around her the land exhaled, the cicadas sang louder, the wind softened, and the horizon swallowed the sun whole. Spirit's white silhouette flickered once more between the trees before vanishing into the wilderness that had once rejected him. But even as darkness fell, his light remained, not in the sky but in the hearts of those who had witnessed his story. Because some lives don't just survive the wild, they change it. And somewhere beyond the ridge, a mother's roar answered, soft, proud, eternal. The danger has passed. The savannah breathes again. The wind hums softly through the acacias, carrying whispers of all that has come and gone, of storms survived, of battles fought, of a bond that defied the laws of nature itself. The sun sets low, painting the land in amber and violet. Somewhere out there, under that endless sky, a pale lion walks beside his mother, a living ghost of hope and resilience. Grace packs her journal, closes the truck door, and lets her gaze linger one last time on the open horizon. She knows the wild will move on, that nature forgets names and faces. But some stories leave scars even the wind remembers. Spirit's white fur catches the final light of dusk, glowing faintly before fading into shadow. For a moment, it's as if the savannah itself bows in reverence. And then, only silence. The wind will carry their story. The narrator's voice softens, because compassion leaves a mark deeper than instinct ever could.